Call this meeting to order. Welcome everybody. First full day of spring, and welcome to meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motion adopted on committee on January 12, 2022. The committee is meeting on the inflation in the current Canadian economy. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website, so you're aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Today's meeting is also taking place in the webinar format. Webinars are for public committee meetings and are available only to members, their staff, and witnesses. Members enter immediately as active participants. All functionalities for active participants remain the same. Staff will be non-active participants and can therefore only view the meeting in gallery view. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Given the ongoing pandemic situation and in light of the recommendations from the health authorities as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on October 19, 2021, to remain healthy and safe, all those attending the meeting in person are to maintain a 2-meter physical distancing, must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room, and it's highly recommended that the mask be worn at all times, including when seated. Must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the provided hand sanitizer at the room entrance. As the chair, I'll be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting and thank members in advance for their cooperation. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming the proceedings. The raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen can be used at any time if you wish to speak or alert the chair. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you're on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. The committee agreed that during these hearings, the chair enforces the rule that the response by a witness to a question take no longer than the time taken to ask the question. That being said, I request that members and witnesses mutually treat each other with respect and decorum. If you think the witness has gone beyond the time, it's the member's prerogative to interrupt or ask the next question and to be mindful of other members' time allocation during the meeting. I also request that members not go much over their allotted question time. Though we will not be interrupting during a member's allotted time, I'd like to keep you informed that our clerk has 2 clocks to time our members and witnesses. I'd now like to welcome today's witnesses. So as individuals, we have Vivek Dehejia. He's the Associate Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Carleton University. And Andy Yan, Director, City Program at Simon Fraser University. From Bâtir son Quartier, we have Edith Sierre, and she's a General Manager. And from the C.D. Howe Institute, we have William B.P. Robson, Chief Executive Officer. From the Ottawa Community Land Trust, we have Ray Sullivan, Executive Director, and from organization The Shift, Leilani Farah, who's the Global Director. At this time, we'll have witnesses are going to have the opportunity to provide us with 5 minutes for opening remarks, and we'll start with the individuals. And Vivek Dehejia, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. There's no doubt that consumer price inflation is a major concern in Canada today. When I wrote back in the fall a warning of the inflation problem, it was at about 4.7%. And now we're at 5.7, the latest numbers from Stats Canada that came out last week. These are the highest inflation rates we've seen since the early 1990s. They're rising. The issue is real, pressing, and is getting worse. Now, we can all agree that inflation is a problem. I think where disputes arise is in trying to understand its causes and its roots. I'll just say very briefly that in my judgment, the roots of the crisis go back to the very unconventional policies followed after the global financial crisis, QE, the large-scale asset purchases, interest rates at or near zero, forward guidance, which is signaling about future policy. So just in layman's terms, central banks made credit available almost for free and flooded the financial system with cash. Now, loose monetary policies had their own perverse effects, which were to distort the real economies of places like Canada and bloat the financial sectors. And with assets in fixed supply like property, we've had huge asset price inflation bordering on bubble territory. In some places, we've had stock markets at record highs. So I'd contend that, in fact, we have two inflation problems, CPI inflation and asset price inflation that makes, for example, even owning a home increasingly out of reach for poor and middle class households, and a big increase in wealth inequalities. Now, today's high CPI inflation is quite simply a response to the explosive growth, from the Bank of Canada's money supply. If you check the data, M1 plus, that's currency in circulation plus checking accounts basically, is growing at 14% year on year. That's a jaw-dropping number, well above the 5 to 6% that would be consistent with low stable inflation. The current interest rate, 0.5%, is well below the Bank of Canada's own estimate of the neutral rate that would keep inflation steady at about 1.75 to 2.75%. So the central bank's and I would just say that the US Fed has seen the danger signals south of the border. Mr. Powell said last week that he's acutely aware of, I quote, of the need to return the economy to price stability and determined to use our tools to do exactly that. Pretty strong words. Governor Tiff Macklem did conclude his remarks here at this committee earlier this month by saying that the bank was going to control inflation, but it's hard to understand how the bank can do that in a case where its policy stance is highly inflationary by any measure. I'll just conclude by saying that inflation is indeed a global problem, but our inflation problem is very much made at home here in Canada. The solution lies at home, and it can't be outsourced. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Dehejia. We are now going to hear, as an individual, Andy Yan for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to address the honorable members of the Standing Committee on Finance. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. My name is Andy Yan, and I'm the director of the City Program at Simon Fraser University, as well as an adjunct professor in urban studies and a registered professional planner. Inflation in the current Canadian economy is an increasingly serious matter for Canadians, as wages for many have stagnated as the costs of living have continued to increase. This can be most vividly seen in housing, as income has become decoupled from housing prices and rents, not only in Vancouver, but increasingly across the country. I will concentrate my comments on my research on housing policy and urban planning in British Columbia, but I think the sobering lessons for the rest of the country are pertinent to this conversation. For a growing amount of young and new Canadians, the dream of home ownership has been going out of reach, and yet for renters, their housing tenure is increasingly precarious, if not affordable or and livable rent is available at all. Since March 2020, the pandemic that has been a disruption for all the lives of Canadians, an acceleration of economic and urban trends, and an amplifier of pre-existing economic vulnerabilities and inequalities between Canadians. It's from this overall state that I'm focusing on three observations that I think frame my conversation today. The housing challenges faced by Canadians follow a specific timeline with specific actions and inactions, intended and unintended consequences within the local, national, and global actors and practices. In 1990, relatively speaking, Canadian city regions were remarkably clustered together in terms of housing to income measures, largely ranging in between 3 and 5 times price to household incomes. But then, of course, today it's been predominantly extended, and you find that a place like Vancouver, based upon even just the last census, was 11 times that multiple, and most likely with the next census by far higher. And that underlying this is fundamentally beyond not only one of inflation, but how fundamentally housing values and rents have really outsped the role of income. Canada's housing challenges aren't just about the delivery of supply, but a combination of changes in behaviors and actors in supply, demand, and finance. Outdated and inflexible zoning and land use practices are only part of the problem, but the problem of housing and its solutions need to be grounded to the question and the answers around whom we are trying to house. That it's clear that there are acute housing shortages for those in particular populations in Canada. In Vancouver, 2/3 of what gets approved to be built in the city is only affordable to 40% of incomes. That the additional demand types through which we've seen emerge within the last 10 years, that they similarly have added additional pressures towards the costs of housing as well in terms of rent and mortgages. We find that activities such as speculation and flipping, short-term rental, aka Airbnb, have eroded rental stocks and have made housing in urban, suburban, and rural communities across the country a difficult situation to one that is worse. Finance has itself been a major kind of challenge in terms of really understanding that housing has increasingly become commodified, become financialized, that really the realm of homes now actually have a second, third, or more homes, just as we have Canadians who have no homes at all. That, again, within this conversation, one has to note really the role of global capital blending in with local lending practices, and that within this element of this environment, renters face really the prospect of becoming a financial underclass in terms of credit and underfunded retirement. Thirdly, public policies have an effect. There are no panaceas, but toolboxes that really offer instruments that need to be able to adapt to local conditions. While building will take years to really achieve at best of times, there are fundamental changes through which public policy can make a sizable difference. British Columbia has been able to break a 40-year pattern of ever increasing vacant and underoccupied units through a mix of provincial and municipal policies in terms of vacant home taxes, speculation, and school taxes. That in terms of vacant and underoccupied homes, we actually find that the policies have actually seen declines in that population by 8%, while jurisdictions that haven't had this, as an example, will be found in the city of Toronto, the increase has actually gone up by 40%. And that fundamentally this discussion around supply of housing towards dealing with the issue of affordability, I think comes at the same time that British Columbia has been able to see starts and completions over the last 3 years higher than any previous 30 years that you find in the province. Indeed, very much in the most recent set of data.
Thank you, Mr. Yan. Thank you. No. And there'll be a lot of time to inform the members more during question time. We are moving to the Bâtir son quartier. Edith's here for 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Chair, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to testify. Bâtir son quartier is a social economy business. We are a not-for-profit, and we are there to meet the needs of low and modest income households through community housing. Up till now, we have 450 projects, totaling 14,000 units. The current context is a source of great concern to us. In the last 20 years, we saw low interest inflation rates and interest rates, which were favorable to housing. But despite this fact, we are currently seeing over 1.8 million Canadian rental households paying over 30% of their income for housing. Nearly 500,000 of these are in Quebec. This is an inverse logic, which is not favorable and which is risking being long-lasting. So there's a great risk for the poorest people in society who are already having difficulties finding adequate housing and feeding. In the Montreal metropolitan community, we're talking about an increase in rent of 4.2% on average, which is the highest increase since 2003. The vacancy rate for affordable housing and family housing is 1%. Normally, a balance would be 3%. Add to this the increased construction costs because of the difficulties in supply, the booming housing market for construction, and the labor shortage. In our housing developments, the average price per square foot to build was about $180 in 2019, whereas now in 2022, it is over $260 or $270 per square foot, which means that for a two-bedroom unit, it costs over $100,000 to build the same unit. And then there's the increase in financing costs because of the increase in interest rates. For example, 1% increase in interest rates, even if there's a lot of nuances in life, we're still talking about $52 a month per unit that has to be increased so as not to run a deficit. Then there's the increase in price of insurance, heating, and other housing-related expenses. So there are consequences when it comes to developing housing developments as well as for managing these housing units. We have an increase in costs and lack of government funding is paralyzing 10,000 housing units. Nearly half of them is in Montreal. We sincerely believe that low and modest revenue households are being subjected to the worst brunt of these changes. Investments require adjustments in the national housing strategy. We have to be able to protect the most vulnerable households from any increase in cost of living. It would be desirable to reattribute and reallocate funds to target these households and adapt the design of certain programs that are already in existence. We believe we have to increase the pace of housing construction, and we want to see a lot of housing unit starts. We believe that community housing can play a significant role as a bastion against precariousness of Canadian households by intervening in a long-standing and long-lasting fashion. Thank you. Thank you, Madame Cyr.
CD Howe Institute, William Robson, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. I hope my observations will be helpful to the committee and its work. I'd like to just say, by way of background, that monetary policy and inflation have been central to my work at the CD Howe Institute since I was a much younger person, all through the high inflation 80s, the tightening that reduced inflation in the 1990s, inflation targeting since then. I chair the Institute's Monetary Policy Council, which offers advice on the Bank of Canada's interest rate settings. Over the period that I've been working on it, things improved. Inflation got lower and more stable. We had fewer episodes of tight and loose monetary policy, which also made the economy more stable. As last week's CPI report really underlined with the unpleasant surprise, that achievement is now, at the very least, at risk. So to prepare for our discussion, three thoughts. One, to start, people hate inflation. I start there because we sometimes hear that inflation is not so bad. Some economists think people should accept it and reject the tighter monetary policy that would reduce it. I think those arguments miss the basic fact that people want their money to have a predictable value. If you ask people how money's value should change over time, how much inflation we should have, most people will say it shouldn't change. They want it to be like other weights and measures. if we step on a scale, if we're measuring flour for a recipe or checking the temperature before we decide what to wear, we take for granted that the kilograms and the cups and the degrees are going to mean the same thing today that they did yesterday. That's why governments regulate weights and measures so we can rely on them. And people want the same with money. That's why the high inflation of the 70s and 80s became a political issue. The cure was painful, but the disease was worse. I think it's understandable that Canadians dislike inflation, and it should be lower. My second opening comment, going to echo some of the things that Professor Dehajia said. The macro view is that inflation means that money is losing its value. If you've got more growth in the supply of money than the demand for it, its value is going to fall relative to the things that we spend it on, and that's what's happening right now. But I emphasize that because daily experience doesn't feel like that. We notice that gasoline costs more when we're filling up than it did last time. Go to the store and lettuce is the surprise this week, and last week it might have been milk. So it feels like different products are taking different size bites out of our dollar rather than the dollar just shrinking over time. I mention that because people often focus on what's up lately as though that caused inflation and as though subsidies or price controls could fix it. But we saw attempts like that in the 1970s, but monetary policy stayed loose and inflation stayed high. I will underline that if you look at the CPI as of the latest readings, it's about 3/4 of the items are up more than 2% year over year. So that's more than at any time since the last 30 years. It's not just specific products, it's a decline in the purchasing power of the Canadian dollar. My last comment before taking your questions is that many advanced economies have inflation rates similar to ours, not because it's inevitable, but because they did similar things in reacting to the pandemic. Choices about monetary policy and fiscal policy got us here, and we are in control of those choices in the future. To just elaborate the point, energy and food are expensive everywhere. Supply chains are stretched everywhere, but inflation isn't the same. It's in double digits in some countries, Argentina and Turkey, for example. It's above 1,000% in Venezuela. It's about 2% in Switzerland, and it's less than 1% in Japan. So inflation's high where monetary policy has been inflationary and low where it has not been. And we're seeing inflation now above our 2% target because our response to the pandemic overshot. I do think we need tighter monetary policy to respond to it, and I look forward to any questions that you have about that, any complementary policies that would make it easier or harder. But my closing comment is that we can do it, and I believe that we should. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. And now we'll hear from the Ottawa Community Land Trust, Ray Sullivan, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to focus my statements on how the national housing strategy is impacted by inflation and its companion higher interest rates. These are forces that will compromise the goals of the national housing strategy unless the Government of Canada makes adjustments. And these adjustments, in my view, will have to be made in the upcoming federal budget. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work in this territory, which is also home to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people from across the continent. And since my comments focus on the national housing strategy, I also have to point out that the Government of Canada has yet to deliver on a non-distinctions-based urban Indigenous housing strategy. And the national housing strategy remains incomplete until that work is done. And I and many others look forward to seeing a significant commitment in the upcoming federal budget. So I'm not a banker. I'm not an economist. I'm just a guy who spent over 2 decades managing and building affordable nonprofit housing. I'm currently executive director of the Ottawa Community Land Trust. Most recently, I was executive director of a large nonprofit housing company. I don't pretend to understand big finance and economic forces, but I do very much understand affordable rental housing, and I do know what it takes to create nonprofit housing. The programs under the National Housing Strategy were developed 5 years ago under historically low interest rates and at a time when rates were stable or even declining. And this has changed, and so the programs themselves must also change if we're to meet the goals of the strategy. I have 3 specific recommendations. First, I want to begin by addressing affordability and inflation from a renter's perspective. Rents were already rising faster than wages before this period of rapid inflation. 40% of tenants across the country can't afford the rents they're paying now. And when everyday costs are also rising, this leaves low-income renters in the position of having to choose between rent and groceries each month. The National Housing Strategy created a national housing benefit, a modest allowance to help low-income households cover their rent. So my first recommendation is that with rising inflation, this needs to be expanded to cover a greater number of households, and it needs to be strengthened to provide more assistance. It has to keep pace with the current need. Secondly, when the National Housing Strategy returned CMHC to direct lending, low interest government loans to create new affordable housing, that was a big deal. But these lending programs need to adjust to an environment of rising interest rates. Under the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, for example, a nonprofit can lock in a 10-year interest rate at the time of their first advance, so after construction has started. Now, waiting as long as possible was an advantage when rates were stable or declining, but now that rates are rising, it transfers risk from the government to the little nonprofits that are trying to create affordable housing. Government needs to commit and lock in borrowing rates much earlier, especially in the current context. Higher interest rates and higher construction and operating costs are squeezing out affordability and limiting our ability to reduce rents. So it now costs more to borrow the exact same amount of money as it did compared to 2 years ago, and it costs more to build it at the same time. So the National Housing Co-Investment Fund was launched. Government officials went through great efforts to stress that it's primarily a loan program, even if modest grants are also available. Well, when the cost to borrow rises and construction costs also rise, there's no cushion in affordable housing. Government will have to make up the gap with richer grants. So my second recommendation, that lending programs need to be redesigned in reaction to the current climate of inflation and rising interest rates. My third and final point is about a long-term strategy for countering rent inflation and by helping us transfer existing properties into nonprofit ownership. In the Ottawa region, for every one new home built with assistance from the National Housing Strategy, we lose 7 affordable homes in the private market. Creating new affordable housing is definitely important, but it doesn't help the majority of modest income renters if the supply of affordable housing is dropping overall at the same time. If governments work with nonprofits to purchase existing rental housing, which is already at modest rents, that allows us to stop the erosion of affordable housing in the marketplace. Right now, CMHC lending programs aren't available for acquisitions, only for new construction. But acquisition is an effective and very efficient option that will allow us to buy and preserve affordable housing in the marketplace right away. So wrapping up, inflation and interest rate increase are creating serious challenges for housing affordability. I've made 3 recommendations focusing on the National Housing Strategy, all of which I hope can be included in upcoming budgets. 1, expand the housing benefit program. 2, rework CMHC direct lending to account for rising interest rates. And 3, allow CMHC direct lending for nonprofits to purchase existing affordable market housing. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. And now we'll hear from the Shift, Leilani Farah, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for inviting me into this conversation. In my capacity as the global director of the Shift, much of my work has focused on the financialization of housing, or the nexus between housing, finance, and human rights. I'm also the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, a position I held for 6 years between 2014 and 2020. Let me start here. Canada, like most Western developed nations, is characterized by a central contradiction. We have a relatively robust economy as a top 10 performing country in terms of GDP, and with an impressive growth rate of about 6.7% as we come out of the pandemic. With this kind of strong economic performance, we'd expect to see the distribution of this growth across all social strata. That is, after all, the point of economic growth. So it's counterintuitive that instead we have growing homelessness and increasing housing unaffordability for low-income renters and also for higher income earners. This contradiction has deepened with pandemic-related inflation, captured perfectly when the Bank of Canada head Tiff Macklem recently celebrated the country's strong economic performance derived through real estate transactions and debt, causing housing prices to skyrocket. This fundamental contradiction can be traced to the values embraced by successive governments in Canada, articulated through laws and policies in the housing and finance sectors, which benefit institutional and other investors. As a result, Canada now has a housing system that has become overly financialized, operating separately from household incomes and housing need. A financialized housing system is when single and multifamily homes become an extractive industry like mining, where housing is used by domestic and global actors to extract wealth, mostly by those who already have an abundance of it, like pension funds and investment trusts. The financialization of housing is rooted in the assertion that given the right legislative and policy conditions, the market will provide what's necessary for the people of this country. The right conditions are things like low interest rates, preferential tax treatment for investors, no regulations on monopoly ownership, weak tenant protections, and a seat at political tables for investors to advise governments. Obviously, the facts on the ground prove this now to be a failed experiment. Value extraction has been confused with value creation, allowing investors to call themselves value creators and in the process extract value. Douglas Porter, the head of BMO, recently said it this way, and I'm paraphrasing. The supply narrative as a solution to the housing crisis that the industry continues to peddle is a myth that happens to benefit those propagating it. So what's to be done? It seems obvious that when one set of values no longer produces reasonable outcomes, governments need to embrace another set that will achieve better outcomes. Human rights is the only framework that has as its goal housing equality, inclusion, affordability, adequacy, and security. Human rights redefines value creation. It sees value in housing as home. It reorients finance and housing policies to focus on individuals experiencing housing need, not investor or shareholder interests, as is the case in a financialized system. It requires that supply-side solutions are led by and targeted by household demand, not by investors. Across the world, I've seen states grappling with the financialization of housing, trying to curb the trend, recognizing that housing is a different sort of business. It's a human rights business that requires proactive measures by government. Denmark enacted legislation that prevents investors from raising rents for 5 years. Singapore has introduced heavy taxation on multiple home purchases by a single investor. New Zealand has asked its central bank to consider housing in its setting of monetary policy. Spain has enacted national right to housing legislation, which penalizes owners who leave homes empty and imposes rent caps on landlords across the country. The city-state of Berlin is contemplating the socialization of private market units. So I'll end by emphasizing this. If you embrace the human rights framework as articulated in the National Housing Strategy Act, and if you breathe life into it by committing to ensure that every fiscal and monetary policy or law has as its end goal ensuring adequate, affordable, and secure housing for those in need, you cannot make a wrong step. I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Farah. And thank you to all the witnesses for your opening remarks. Now we are moving into members' question time. The first round of questions. Each party will have up to 6 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. And we're starting with the Conservative Party and MP Albus for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for making your time available for Canadians today. I'm going to start with first with Professor Diéja. Hopefully I got your name right, sir, but I do appreciate the submission you did earlier on. And I just wanted to ask, first of all, there's a recent research paper, Not Your Parents' Real Estate Market by TD Asset Management, and explained how low interest rates and quantitative easing are the two main reasons why house prices have significantly increased since the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. The paper also expressed the opinion that Canada's housing market was currently in a speculative state in which prices are derived from extrapolating recent trends rather than fundamentals. So, sir, do you believe that low interest rates and quantitative easing are the two main reasons why housing prices has significantly increased since the global financial crisis, 2008-2009? And if not, what are the main reasons you believe for the state of the Canadian housing market today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I absolutely do agree with that. And in fact, in my submission, I pointed to, and in my brief remarks, to unconventional monetary policies as drivers of asset price inflation. So quite simply, when you flood the financial system with all of that cash, when you drive interest rates down almost to zero, and signal that they're going to stay zero or low for a long time to come, it really dries up sort of credible investment opportunities in the real economy because basically money is free to borrow. So what that does is drive all of that cash into different kinds of asset markets. So stock markets, even during the pandemic, were reaching record highs. Property prices are at record highs and in bubble territory. So, you know, I have to say, when I hear the argument that low interest rates are good for homeowners or good for those who want to buy a home, I find that argument quite strange because, yes, it's true that for a given value of your home, a lower rate is good for you, but lower rates have actually inflated property prices. So, yes, at the margin, you benefit from a lower rate, but if your house has tripled in value, a new homeowner is just locked out of that market. So indeed, I would point to those as principal drivers. You know, we have distorted the real economy of Canada and many other countries. I think that unconventional policies were well-intentioned. They made sense for the first couple of years, but they are now well past their sell-by date. They're a cure worse than the disease at this point, Mr. Chair.
So thank you for that, and I appreciate how you've gone from the macro picture in terms of the overall money supply and some of these policies like quantitative easing and how that's changed it, but how it really affects particularly certain markets like housing. So getting to housing, how is mortgage insurance contributing to the imbalance between housing supply and demand by encouraging banks and other financial institutions to offer households more mortgage credit without taking the limited housing supply into account?
That certainly contributes. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I should speak to the chair. That certainly contributes. I mean, I would say that in my judgment, at the margin, that's certainly a factor. And I think that's been noted by several of the speakers earlier that there's a serious mismatch between housing supply and housing demand. You can't blame that entirely on monetary policy. But my point again remains is that when you have a relatively fixed stock of housing at a given point in time, and all of that cash is pouring into that market because it becomes kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Prices are going up, more cash comes into that market, people buy more property, goes up even higher. So you get into a point, the real paradox, Mr. Chair, is that it was a housing market bubble, the US subprime mortgage crisis, that caused the financial crisis. And then our response to it, paradoxically, is again recreating the problem that we tried to fix. So I find that very perplexing. So I would say, Mr. Chair, that at the margin, there are a number of factors, and the way that mortgage insurance works certainly, is part of that. But I would, again, without sounding like a broken record, point to the real distortions that zero interest rates, almost zero interest rate, and flooding the market with all of this cash. I mean, we have monetary aggregates just off the charts. Money is growing like crazy. That's going to distort the economy and make housing unaffordable, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you. And just before I finish my round, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Robson a question in regards to, the memos that he's sent in, the intelligent memos. One of the things that inflation seems to do is seems to reward those that are servicing high levels of debt. So those people that have gotten into the market, or in this case, a Liberal government that has gotten heavily into debt. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, low interest rates certainly make it easier to borrow. What I'll say with respect to the housing issue particularly is that when interest rates get very low, the effect on asset values becomes noticeably non-linear. It's geometric. And so I think that it's very realistic to say that low interest rates are responsible for some of the valuations we've seen in housing markets and sort of generated that momentum. And when interest rates go up, even by modest amounts, I think we're going to see quite a marked change in that area, for better or for worse. But much of the commentary here has been concerned about those high asset prices. To the question about interest rate changes, they certainly do tempt people to borrow more. It makes saving less attractive. It makes consuming in the here and now a good deal more attractive. Part of the difficulty that we are going to face as monetary policy tightens is that people are going to feel the pinch from those higher interest rates. And that's why there will be concern among people generally who have floating rate mortgages or are otherwise exposed. And the government is going to find that the cost of its financing it already is, with long bond rates where they are now above what was predicted. And so there's going to be a certain amount of commentary there that if only monetary policy would ease up, fiscal policy wouldn't have to be so tight. I don't look forward to that debate because it seems to me that inflation being low and stable really has to take priority. That's fundamental. And you don't want to undermine that target because it makes it harder for the government to borrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Robson. MP Albus, we're moving to the Liberals now, and MP MacDonald for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all the guests here today. I'm going to start with Mr. Yan. And relevant to your expertise and education in the field of planning, can you share with us any areas of the country where planning decisions have been taken in a manner that effectively preserve and expand affordable housing options?
Mr. Yan?
Sorry about that.
Mr. Yan?
Yep. Hi there. So I think that it's very much, I think the examples that really have occurred when governments work together, when multiple levels of government have worked together to produce affordable housing. And I think that this is where we can find the kind of history of really when the federal government worked together with the provincial and local governments that, well, actually one of the best examples is in the South Falls Creek neighborhood of Vancouver, that you'll find that by working together in terms of multiple levels of government, coordinating their policies and towards development, towards land acquisitions, that you've been able to produce a level of affordability and inclusion.
Thank you. And recently you were quoted in the Globe and Mail article discussing wage inflation and labor market impacts of so many young Canadians leaving the large cities. What can governments do to try to entice the demographic back to our cities, and what may be the risks to the economy and labor force if we're unable to do so?
I think that it very much, you'll see an exodus of talent. And I think that part of this is understanding that there is this tremendous diversity within this population of young people, and that within this type of consequence is really the inability to actually start your careers in and grow it in Canada, and the exodus into other more I think into countries which offer higher wages. And I think that this is one of the biggest challenges that we have towards operating in a global economy.
Thank you. And can you speak to the phenomenon of foreign-owned property, particularly in Vancouver, and just what it's doing basically to that city and the housing product?
I think that what it's done is that it's brought in towards a pre-existing condition, and worse, that you have properties through which, depending upon when they were built and what they are, you'll see that upwards of 20% of certain stocks are owned by folks who don't live in Canada. And that really, I think, has another distortive effect through which the various policies on the provincial level in British Columbia have attempted to address. But then now there's evidence that it has actually moved eastwards, particularly in markets like Toronto, through which I'm happy to talk about later on. But then through some of my latest research, it actually shown really how that has kind of spread out into the rest of the country.
Yes, certainly. We're even seeing it far east as Prince Edward Island, so it's very interesting. How many years does this go back? Like, when did this start? How many years have we been actually dealing with this problem, but it's really surfaced in the past 10 to 15 years?
That's precisely it, Mr. Chair. Is that it's an issue that has a particular timeline, and it started approximately 10 to 15 years ago. I think through which my existing research actually talked about how it's just accelerated, and it's fundamentally not only about foreign money, but it's how foreign capital has mixed in towards local lending practices. The issue isn't about only foreigners per se, but it's about foreign capital and how capital from around the world is landing in Canada for safety, and in that type of safety, it's distorting property values.
Do you have any examples that you could share with us that you know firsthand of the consequences of this?
I think fundamentally you can see it in Vancouver, that part of really how the speed through which this type of increase in housing values compared to local incomes has been most acute in the city of Vancouver, but then through which now the certain levels of policies at both the local and the provincial levels that we've seen at least just a staunching of that, but yet at the same time, of course, other factors have now replaced them to also drive housing values. But then I think it's really how we've really dealt with the issue of foreign capital, and that yet it still remains a sizable challenge, and looking for policy and leadership at the federal level.
How much time is it?
A minute and a half.
Minute and a half, good. So the government of the day introduced the underused housing tax. And what are your thoughts on taxation of underused homes?
I think that it is a policy through which can be directed into particular markets. I think that it's mixing in with the issue of underused homes, but then also I think the emergence of disruptive technologies and prop tech, and the role of property technologies, whether that be Airbnb, examples of short-term rental, aka Airbnb, to really platforms that are, I think, distorting the rental expectations of prospective landlords in terms of faulty algorithms that really maximize the amount of rents, as opposed to really connecting up to those who really need rental housing. So
I see in an article too in CBC you were supportive of BC's new cooling off period. Do you think this practice would work elsewhere across the country?
I think that it goes directly into the role of transparency and consumer protection, and the role through which I think the federal government can produce a level of leadership in terms of ensuring that Canadians are protected in the biggest purchase of their lives.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yan. MP MacDonald, we are moving to the bloc. And Monsieur Trudel for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Madame Cyr. Madame Cyr, thank you for your presentation, and thanks to all the witnesses who've appeared today. Madame Cyr, I'd like to begin by asking you to explain to us what makes your groups unique for benefit of our English Canada groups. And maybe 20 years ago, these sorts of groups existed across the countries, but now it's unique to Quebec. What is the significance of these groups in construction and housing developments in community housing? Thanks for your question. Technical resource groups, or GRTs in French, are tools to develop community housing. We listen and tune into needs, and when their needs are expressed, we are specialized in community housing. So we accompany groups as they try to have housing built, whether it's looking for land, for a piece of property, for a building, financing, coordination of professionals, and training in managing property. So these groups have made it possible to develop about all of the community housing in Quebec over the years. Thank you. According to a report I'm sure you're familiar with from Frappru, which is a fund, an organization for community housing, the government had invested in community housing, and then around 1993 they stopped doing this, and then the GRTs launched about 5 years ago because there had been too many years of non-investment. According to Frappru, in Quebec, only 80,000 more social housing units have been introduced into the marketplace. We would have less of a housing shortage problem and less of an affordability issue if the housing units that should have been built had been built. Isn't this a proof that it's important for the federal government to get involved in building affordable social housing in Quebec? Yes, absolutely. It's necessary for the federal government to pursue its investments and continue them and reorient them. I think that we've explained that the current context is different. The programs were developed in context X, and now we're dealing with a different context. There is a need, if you want to achieve the goals of the strategy, we have to go back to the programs and review them. Sometimes we have to adjust them. We have to retarget our assistance. And I add to what Mr. Sullivan was saying, I add my voice to his. As costs are increasing, we need additional grants. We need assistance for the individuals. In other words, increase in assistance to individuals. And also, we need there to be interventions to save the fleet of available housing, so protect the acquisitions. Federal programs, for example, the co-investment and the rental housing programs, are based on the median rents in the marketplace in Montreal. That gives you about a level that just doesn't seem to make sense. Should we not base ourselves on the capacity to pay of a given household versus the government subsidies, especially when we're talking about public money? Well, there are two problems in the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. There's some for a section of it for lower income, and then we have to say that the rest have to help fund the others. So rents can go very high to help fund the 30% of units that are lower cost. But you're right. For a while now, we've been talking about affordable housing. And affordable housing is increasing as the average rent is increasing. But revenues are not increasing at the same pace. So the definition of what constitutes affordable housing should be reviewed so that we refer to households' abilities to pay. Now, in your presentation, I think you mentioned that recent data talked about material and labor costs increasing renovation and maintenance costs by about 25% in Quebec this year in the rental area. Do you have any projects that you've put on hold because of the situation? Yes. In Bâtir son quartier organization, we have about 1,460 units that are on ice for the time being. And when I say on ice, these are projects that were well advanced, but at some point funding was not indexed. And so we were blocked, we're paralyzed. We have 5,000 other units because, as you know, real estate is not 1 year at a time. This is something that you have to work on for a long time before you can get to actually building something. We need some predictability. So we've worked on projects which are at various stages in development. The 1,400 are at very advanced stage, but we have another 5,000 as well. So when I'm talking about 10,000 units in Quebec, I'm not even talking about the ones that are in development or being prepared. So a need for predictability in housing and community housing. Generally speaking, in Quebec, there are many different groups. There's the Quebec groups for not-for-profit housing. There's Frappru. There are housing co-ops. And I think generally speaking, federal government programs go too much to private developers, and they should be focused more on local groups who are more aware of the community's needs. In other words, should the money being spent be reoriented to groups who are really familiar with the reality on the ground and who are able to ensure long-term affordability? What do you think of that? I've always said that I want all Canadians to be able to have decent housing. If a government has to make fiscal choices, they should be targeting the people who are the most in need. And when I say target those who are the most in need, we tend to target what I would call a clientele. We'll say, oh, women who are victims of violence or homeless people. It's fine, we need to meet those needs. But we should never neglect the fact that there's somebody who doesn't have necessarily a specific need, but there is the essential need for accessible, affordable housing in a sector that's just becoming overcrowded. Thank you, MP Putel.
And we're moving to the NDP, and welcome MP Garrison to our committee, and you have 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. It's always a pleasure to be in the Finance Committee, although it's been quite a long time since I've been here. But it's always a pleasure to be able to address the issues of housing in my riding. Right now, our definition of affordability says 30% of the households before tax income is affordable. And we all know that. But if you look at my riding, then that means that the median household income is about $72,000, and it means what's affordable is $1,800 per month by that definition, except that that's below the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment. So not only is it a strange way of figuring out what's affordable, it doesn't even meet the average cost if you're paying an affordable amount of rents in my riding. So I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Yan about how we as a committee, how we as a parliament could address that gap between this affordability definition and the actual prices people have to pay to get housing.
Thank you so much for the question, Mr. Chair. I think that fundamentally it's going into the inefficiencies of measuring the issue of unaffordability. I think that fundamentally you have to look at that. If I put on another hat, is that some of this is really expanding the idea that we also need to consider housing adequacy. And some of the leadership that's being done in this field is actually by the Statistics Bureau in New Zealand, where they've begun to understand that there is an issue of housing adequacy as opposed to just housing affordability. That how you deal with the issue of housing adequacy is looking at the specifics of what are these units that people are able to purchase as opposed to just a raw unit itself. What's the format? Are they 1, 2, 3-bedroom units that are ready for families? I think that part of this is also looking from the federal government perspective, not only looking at the funding as well as the acquisition of housing, it's also fundamentally looking at infrastructure, looking at elements such as public transportation, through which has a means of dealing and controlling living costs. That is, I think, a way of understanding the full cost of living in the various communities in Canada.
Thanks very much. We've seen the spectacle in my riding of landlords suggesting to people when they show up to look at a unit that if they're prepared to pay more than the advertised rent, that they can be the successful bidder. So in fact, we've got bidding going on, a kind of black market bidding to get housing. And what that results in is those with double incomes and no kids, of course, need housing like everybody else, but they're able to pay a higher price, and so they can secure those units. So we have lots of people who are in effect excluded from the rental housing market in my riding. So my second question is about how investments in social housing both would help house those people and how they might bring down costs in the housing market in a broader sense. And I'll ask again to Mr. Yan.
I think that fundamentally, if there is another element of deficit, if there is a non-market housing deficit, and it's been a deficit that has not been paid off for almost 20 years, and that we've only now slowly begun meeting that deficit, but nowhere at the pace through which needs to happen. And I think that is really where direct investment in construction as well as acquisition of housing for the non-market sector offers the greatest solutions in the fastest expedient times.
Mr. Yan, would you say that CMHC is capable of doing that as it's now constituted, or are they going to have to make some fundamental changes in their approach?
I think that fundamentally it's enabling CMHC to expand its programming not only in towards construction costs, but then really in looking at the role of unit acquisition, of really purchasing, having the right for first purchase. That there is, I think, the role in government to enter the realm of offering stable, affordable housing at local cost. And I think that is one of the ongoing challenges, is really the role of providing non-market housing across the spectrum, not only in terms of supportive housing, but then into elements and alternative market arrangements like co-op housing.
And thanks for raising co-op housing. We have a lot of co-op housing units in my riding in Victoria who were built 30 years ago. They're relatively low density. And there's some creative co-op boards have been looking at trying to leverage the low density by building a higher density on their current sites and offering some more one-bedroom units, for instance, when they're mostly three-bedroom units. But they're finding difficulty in financing that change, to finance that kind of redevelopment. Is there anything CMHC could do to help finance those innovative ways of renewing co-op housing?
I think that's a similar type of process where you enable as well as empower CMHC to allow for that type of development, for that redevelopment, as well as long-term supports for developments like co-ops. You'll find that in False Creek South, there is a very active citizens group that is very much towards looking at the role of densification, of redevelopment, that really does enable and extend the amount of non-market housing in Vancouver.
Okay. Thank you, MP Garrison. And members, we are moving into our second round of questions. In this round, members will have 5 minutes and some 2.5 minutes. We're starting with the Conservatives. We have MP Stewart up for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for Associate Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Carleton, Professor DeHasia. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. If I'm not, please feel free to correct me on that. Professor, do you think the inflation that Canadians are facing today is transitory?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. No, I don't think it's transitory.
Mr. DeHagia.
Could you have him repeat the answer?
Mr. DeHagia, can you repeat the answer, please? We lost you for about 20 seconds.
Sure. I think I heard an echo there, but I think that stopped. Mr. Chair, I certainly don't think that our inflation problem now is driven by transitory factors. I think when you look at the reality of it, in fact, Mr. Robson mentioned correctly that some 3/4 or more of the basket in the CPI has gone up in price. So that isn't just because of the war in Ukraine or oil or supply disruptions from the pandemic. Those things, sure, at the margin, my back of the envelope would be maybe 1% of our current 5.7% are factors that may disappear. But when the money supply is growing at 14%, 20%, it is basically a monetary phenomenon. We're just printing too much money. So I'd say no, it's not transitory.
Thank you, Professor. Can you tell the committee why you think inflation won't go away anytime soon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say, we've seen this movie before and it doesn't end well. I mean, think back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and we were having similar conversations, around are these going to just be temporary problems that disappear? And then we saw, then Governor John Crow really take charge and engineer maybe one of the most important disinflation experiences in the history of really any modern country. He did succeed. He had the moral support of the then Prime Minister of Canada and his government, but it was very costly. Some of the side effects were that the dollar became overvalued. That made the recession that had to occur. I mean, that correction was necessary, and the tough medicine did work, but it was a painful process. So I think that, the more we kick the can down the road and say, oh, it's transitory, it's something else, the worse the problem gets, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor. Do you think that government overspending and lack of monetary policy has been a major contributor to inflation in Canada?
Mr. Chair, I'd put it this way, that government spending, in a sense, abetted by monetary loose policy. In other words, when government spending is monetized, when the Bank of Canada buys up all of that government debt and then pumps it back out into the economy, into the financial sector, that monetizing of government spending absolutely is worsening inflation. So there's a kind of symbiotic relationship, again, going back to the financial crisis, where for better or worse, sort of that wall between finance and the central bank broke down. They coordinated to try and fend off the crisis, but that symbiosis has remained, unfortunately, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor. Government is continuously insisting that everything with respect to inflation is related to the pandemic. Do you have any comments on that topic?
Mr. Chair, I certainly would strongly disagree with that view. It's very tempting to blame something that's beyond the control of the government of the day or the central bank. But again, the facts speak for themselves. If you look at money supply growth after being a steady 4, 5, 6%, sort of where it should be, Some aggregates were growing at 40%, 50% until recently. And that has nothing to do with the pandemic or Ukraine or supply disruptions. That is just excessively inflationary, loose monetary policy, also monetizing government spending. Really, that's 99% of the problem, Mr. Chair.
Professor, do you believe that oil prices will impact the prices we pay in the grocery store, in the grocery aisles? If so, how?
Mr. Chair, I mean, there certainly will be a feed-through effect of higher oil prices. It costs more to get stuff here. We have supply disruptions already through the pandemic, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not making that any better. But again, if I were to parse the increase in prices of the 5.7% year-on-year inflation we have now, I would and the rest of it is really a bad monetary policy, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Stewart. That's your time. We're moving to the Liberals. MP Zarowitz for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all our panelists today. Excellent discussion and presentation, so appreciate you being here. I'll just start off by just mentioning there is, I think, a number of diverse opinions about there in terms of our emergency measures and our spending. If you hear from Stephen Poloz, who's now special advisor at Osler and the former governor of the Bank of Canada, he would say that Canada's ability to navigate the pandemic should be very commended, as well as and very much, I think, lauds the work that we have done around the emergency measures. I do think it's important for everyone to note that we have since last summer, so actually it's been more than a summer, been tightening up our emergency measures funding, and it's been far more targeted. We know that it's needed to be targeted. And I think that it's also important to note that based on the learnings that we had from the 2008 financial crisis, it was very important for our government to try to ensure that we create a foundation from which businesses could pivot. So we want to make sure that we tied employees to their places of business. And so that was also a key concern. So we try to take some learnings from 2008, try to create that foundation. We've found that it has been very successful when we look at how many jobs have actually come back and when we've looked at GDP growth in Canada. And I think it's also important to note, just because I believe we should also always be tackling income inequality. You get economic historians like Adam Towes of Columbia University, who lauds Canada in terms of us doing a great job in terms of a more equal distribution of our emergency funds. So I think that it should be noted that we, at every point, I think our government tried to do its best in a very unpredictable economic environment and unpredictable sort of pandemic. Of course, there's going to be some unintended consequences, and I think that we are talking about one of them. So housing is a huge issue for our government. It's important to note that we all believe that it should be addressed. There's been a lot of dollars and resources appropriately so allocated to tackling the housing crisis that we have now in Canada and the affordability crisis. $4 billion allocated for a housing accelerator fund, $2.5 billion for rapid housing strategy, lots of money in terms of renewing sort of co-op agreements and paying to for housing, current Toronto community housing maintenance, and a few other things. I think my first question is going to go to Ms. Farah. Ms. Farah, I fundamentally also believe that every Canadian should have a right to affordable, safe, accessible housing. How would you suggest we proceed with that in Canada, given the fact that all three levels of government have different tools to be able to address the housing crisis? If you could provide advice on how do we proceed on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And the federal nature of this country does make housing complicated at times, and there isn't always really good synergies between the different levels of government. I work a lot with city governments, and I hear a lot from in this country, and I hear a lot from them about the lack of synergies. But I would say it is the federal government's role to show leadership, even though they don't have constitutional jurisdiction over housing. They certainly have constitutional jurisdiction over the spending power, and I do think there needs to be even though those numbers you gave us were, somewhat impressive compared to yesteryear, I still don't find the quality of conversation and policy moves to be as ambitious as they need to be to solve this crisis, to be perfectly honest. One thing that hasn't been discussed at all is the role of real estate investment trusts and how they are driving up the cost of housing and rental accommodation in particular, that is in fact somewhat affordable for people across the country. And that's as a direct result of preferential tax treatment. It's the only kind of trust pretty much in this country that doesn't actually have to pay income tax. And so that gives them a leg up, coupled with all of the conversation we've already had around low interest rates and free and cheap money. So the combination of those, supported by CMHC, that's giving mortgage insurance for these acquisitions by these investors, is creating incredible pressure on tenants. And so I do see the need for CMHC to look at when they're giving mortgage insurance, why don't they attach some conditions to that mortgage insurance? The federal government changing the tax regime around real estate investment trusts. Those would be two big moves that could really move the country forward.
Thank you. And that's
thank you
the time.
so much.
Thank you, MP Zarowitz. We're moving to the block. MP Trudel for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Cyr, again, to respond to my Liberal Party colleague, I think the government programs, when you're talking about government programs achieving their targets, in the National Housing Strategy, there was a committee to determine whether the goals of the strategy were being achieved, and there was the National Housing Council, and they published an initial report recently at mid-mandate of the 10-year mandate, and they said that only half of the co-investment fund housing units for families and single people in a desperate need for housing. This is the National Council that said this. They were the ones who were supposed to audit the program, and roughly 1/3 of investments could come from low-income housing, and even worse for single-parent homes, which are constantly increasing. Nearly no housing in the funded national strategy funding were for those types of families. That's rather scandalous. What do you think of that report, Madam Cyr? Well, that's a very big question to ask me to comment on the whole report. But what I could say is this. The Canadian government has a national strategy, and the amounts for housing. We see in this report that there were targets that have not been met. I think affordable housing is one of the important targets the government wished for. So we have to look at the programs. We have to redirect them to be sure that we can meet the targets. I think that there are existing programs. For example, when we're talking about co-investment, take a closer look. There are changes that can be made. There are programs which are initiatives which are achieving their targets somewhat better. So what makes it possible to achieve the targets? One of the ways of producing affordable housing is to target community housing, social housing, because the very mission of the organizations is to meet household needs via affordable housing creation. So I think the idea is to team up and direct the financing so that it is given with that purpose. I have to ask my question next time. Thank you, Madam Cyr.
Move to the NDP and MP Garrison for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying a thank you to Ms. Farha for her work on emphasizing the right to housing. And she gave the committee a couple of very specific things on reducing the demand side that might help. By taxation of real estate trusts. And on CMHC, she raised the question of some things CMHC could do. I wonder if she has other specific suggestions on that demand side for the committee.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. And sure, I mean, there's a lot that could be done on the demand side. Some of my co-panelists have already articulated some of these things. I have to say, one of the things that shocks me about Canada is that we don't have a sense of who is in need and where are they in need. I actually think there needs to be a national audit, city by city, region by region, place by place, that really enumerates who is in need, what are the income brackets, who is living in homelessness, et cetera. We do point-in-time counts across the country. That's orchestrated nationally. We could do the same, a national audit. So I just want to say that. But also, it strikes me that none of the programming to date, none of the policies, national housing strategy, and decisions taken by finance, and those need to be melded together better because they're operating in different fields at the moment. But none of them are taking a look at what are your human rights obligations, what is actually required of government. And once you do that, you end up in the place where Madame Cyr was talking, which is targeted approaches. In my opinion, any new unit that's built at this point has to go to those who are in need. Has to. This isn't just light stuff. This is a major crisis confronting this country. 235,000 people living in homelessness. It's an embarrassment in such a rich country. We have people living in parks. We have people who've never been homeless before falling into homelessness because they can't pay their rent. So, I think every move that gets made by finance or by the National Housing Strategy folks needs to be targeted to those most in need.
Thank you, MP Garrison. That's the time. We're moving to the Conservatives. MP Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for coming today. Unfortunately, we have limited amount of time and some very wonderful folks here. I'm going to focus my questions with Mr. Robson to start with. Mr. Robson, I commend you for a well-timed opinion piece in the Globe and Mail today. Would like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But perhaps before we get there, we've had a number of economists before this committee, the Bank of Canada, including some chief economists of financial institutions, who are painting a very different picture about the economy than the one the Department of Finance is painting. Growth is robust. The slack has been absorbed in the economy. Unemployment is below where it was prior to the pandemic. These are all good things. So why is it that we need to continue with significant amounts of deficit spending?
Well, I myself would prefer to see the deficit disappear quite quickly. There was a reference earlier to what happened in 2008, 2009. And what I very much liked about what the federal government did after that episode was that it did, after having run a deficit much bigger than it wanted to, get the budget back to surplus. And that meant that a lot of the bills that would have otherwise been passed forward indefinitely were paid more by the people who benefited from some of the fiscal stimulus at the time. I'm not seeing that same approach this time. And it does concern me, not just that some of the pandemic-related spending has gone on perhaps longer than it should have, but we're seeing other types of spending as well. The federal government's own operating spending, federal government employment is way up. And those things are going to be very hard to rein in when the time comes to get the budget back to balance.
Thank you very much. So what I'm hearing is, the fiscal plan of this federal government is to spend at every single stage of the business cycle, which clearly is not a sustainable fiscal path. You, in your op-ed today, had a recommendation on what you would like to see as a fiscal anchor. Would you just like to comment on that, please?
I think that there's no substitute for a target on the bottom line, and I would like to see it zero when it comes to how much borrowing and what that means practically as a small surplus. My main reason for that is that with the debt, well, two reasons. The debt to GDP ratio has not proved to be a very serious constraint. The other reason is that when you've got a particular target on the bottom line, such as zero, every dollar of spending needs to be justified in terms of the dollar that you don't spend somewhere else or the dollar of revenue that you will raise ways to pay for it. At the moment, we're in a bit of a spirit of money appearing to be free. Because of the conversation on housing, I'll just say I'd be wary of any program that relies on decades of big federal government subsidies, because I think that the money is going to dry up at some point, and that pinch is going to be less serious the sooner we get on with getting the budget back to balance and the debt under control.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about inflation for a minute. Your initial testimony indicated that many people don't like inflation, but in fact, there's some entities that are significantly benefiting from a windfall of revenues. Who might that be?
Well, I didn't say it in my testimony. There is a protected class. MPs are actually among them. You have indexed pensions. Federal employees have indexed pensions. Most people don't. So for people who don't have indexed pensions, a long period of high inflation is extraordinarily stressful and destructive. Their debtors do benefit from surprise inflation. At the moment, one of the big questions, and it relates to the earlier question about transitoriness, is if inflation continues, how much is it a surprise? At the moment, long-term interest rates are quite low, but they are rising. And one of the things that concerns me about the current episode is that if inflation expectations start to rise and we start to see that feeding through into long-term interest rates, it gets harder for the Bank of Canada to bring inflation back down. If people are still expecting 2% over the long run, then it's not that jarring a change. But once people have started to build in 4, 5, 6 or more percentage increases into their wage and pricing plans, getting inflation down gets a lot more painful.
Okay, thank you. One final question, Mr. Robson. The federal government's actually seeing its revenues increase substantially in this time of inflation. In fact, there's some discussion about governments around the world preferring to let inflation run hot so that it helps them pay off their debts. The Bank of Canada quietly released a paper early March where it talked about the credibility of the central bank and not wanting to bend to fiscal policy. When the Bank of Canada was presented with a fiscal plan that doubled the size of the national debt, do you think that the bank had really much choice other than to purchase government bonds if it wanted to keep interest rates low?
A short answer, please.
The Bank of Canada needed to create liquidity in the short run because of the pandemic, but I have a lot of concern that they seem to be taking responsibility for long-term interest rates, not just the overnight rate that they use for monetary policy. And to that extent, I think that they are getting into problematic territory, and the credibility of the low inflation target will be much greater if the government's debt weren't seen as potentially unsustainable.
Thank
you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, MP Chambers. We're moving to the Liberals. MP Baker for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I wish I could ask questions of all of you, but I won't have the time. But I will start with Mr. Robson. I did want to clarify something with you, Mr. Robson. You've spoken about monetary policy, so I've heard your points on that. But it sounds as though what you've said is that you believe that the fiscal policy of the government that there's been too much government spending. In other words, fiscal policy has been too expansionary. And I guess my question to you is like I've been thinking as I've been in this discussion in prior meetings of this committee about what the alternative would have been had, for example, during COVID, we had not had that expansionary fiscal policy. And just for the folks watching at home, what we mean by expansionary fiscal policy is the government spending significant sums of money to support businesses, to support individuals who lost their jobs, to buy vaccines, those sorts of things. But most of that went into supports for businesses and individuals to prevent bankruptcies and insolvencies and homelessness and that sort of thing. So I guess my question to you is do you believe that the government should not have done those things? Is that what you're saying, or are you saying something different? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to make sure I'm clear.
No, I was very supportive of many of those initial steps. And in fact, the wage subsidy was one where I was on the record as having said that the early proposals weren't strong enough to create that continued labor market attachment. So I think that many elements of that initial response to the pandemic were very well done. And I would cut quite a bit of slack given the speed at which they had to happen for some of the problems in design that were inevitable on that kind of a fast rollout. Having said all that, though, problems recur regularly, including fairly substantial crises, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine reminds us of that. And so I would like to see policy, and I mentioned the 2008-09 parallel, a fiscal policy that got the budget back towards surplus more quickly than is currently in prospect. And as I mentioned already, so I'll just quickly repeat, a lot of the spending initiatives that we have seen have not been to do with the pandemic, including the expansion in the federal government's own operating costs. That has a long tail, for example, much higher pension costs going forward. So the difficulty that I have is that it doesn't appear that we're going to be robustly positioned for whatever comes next, whether it's another pandemic, war, dealing with climate change, other challenges that are going to be out there for future Canadians to deal with. They should have the fiscal capacity to deal with them.
Okay. And so what I hear you saying, and I don't mean to oversimplify, but what I hear you saying, I think, is you're comfortable with sort of the past decisions around COVID-related spending. It's more forward-looking, where you'd like to see more fiscal restraint. Is that
Yes.
a fair way to summarize it? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. I have, I think, 2 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken, Chair. If I may, I'm going to direct my questions to you, Mr. Yan, if I may. I was very interested in some of the things that you were saying about foreign capital in our housing market, foreign ownership of housing. Do you have any? Are you able in any way to give us to quantify for us what the impact of sort of foreign capital is on prices in our housing market? I think you're muted, sir.
Thank you. I think something that I think any number of researchers have been attempting to look at and to begin to quantify. I think that fundamentally we see the beginnings of this data in the Canadian Housing Statistics Program. We've discovered that in certain markets with certain product types of housing, that you find that 20% of, say, condominiums in Richmond, British Columbia, are owned by people who don't live in the country. And I think that really kind of begins this type of initial research. This is still in its kind of embryonic stage. I think that fundamentally we still need to fundamentally get on top and actually follow the lead of any number of countries in terms of dealing with foreign capital in our residential real estate markets.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is we haven't really, to your knowledge, that hasn't been quantified yet to be able to give a precise sort of a range. Even are you able to give a range as to the impact in terms of the impact on prices or the number of people who are crowded out as a result?
We're slowly moving into this process. We've discovered, for example, that amount is, well, in the case of a specific measure, $75 billion in Vancouver, as an example, are actually owned by these entities that aren't actually or are individuals who don't actually live in Canada. And again, that begins that type of conversation. It's something that I think is part of the new leadership that has occurred in terms of the investments of measuring systems that has occurred within just the last 4 years. And I think that this is a process that we still need to continue.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And thank you, MP Baker. That is the time. Members, we are moving into our third round now, and we have first up the Conservatives, MP Fast, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to ask a few questions. My questions are directed to Messrs. Dehaja and Robson. The governor of our central bank recently appeared before us and effectively denied that his monetary policy has contributed to higher inflation. And actually, when given an opportunity to implicate excessive government stimulus spending, he similarly demurred. So perhaps a question to you, Mr. Robson, is Mr. Macklem correct in suggesting that the Bank of Canada's policies have not contributed to skyrocketing inflation?
It seems hard to absolve the Bank of Canada from responsibility. I would cut them slack. As I said, I would cut the federal government slack because at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't clear how much liquidity was going to be enough. And I think erring on the side of providing more under the circumstances was understandable. But what we are clearly seeing now is that we are supporting desired spending in the economy. Nominal GDP up 12% year over year. That's far in excess of of what the economy can actually produce in terms of goods and services, up 3% in real terms year over year. The difference between the 12 and the 3 is 9% increase in the level of prices when you measure it across the entire economy. So I think the Bank of Canada has to take some responsibility for that. We've seen that inflation recently is well ahead of what they projected in their last monetary policy report. The logic of that suggests that they should be ready to tighten policy by more than they have been suggesting as well.
Mr. Dehaja, you stated that large-scale asset purchases by the central bank have flooded the market with liquidity. I'm assuming the conclusion we can all draw is that that has spawned the inflationary pressures we're presently experiencing.
Mr. Chair, yes, indeed. And I would say, again, I would add that I think we have two inflation problems that have been spawned by unconventional policy. We have now rising CPI inflation, but we also have asset price inflation, and those have both have been very problematic, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Dehaja, I've noted that distinction that you've made. The government has suggested that inflation is actually a global phenomenon, effectively absolving them of any responsibility for the current inflationary pressures we're experiencing in Canada. And yet, I believe your testimony, Mr. Dehaja, and also Mr. Robson's testimony suggest otherwise. Am I correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, indeed. I think the claim that it's a global problem would seem to imply that it absolves the government or the central bank from doing anything about it. But it's a global problem because many countries have had a very loose monetary policy, well beyond where they should have tightened up. So it's a global problem because other central banks have also been very, very loose with their policy. So our problem is made in Canada and can only be solved here. So I find that sort of a cop-out, Mr. Chair, this claim that it's a global problem.
Mr. Robson, do you have any sense as to how high interest rates would now have to go in order to get inflation under control?
As time goes by, I am increasing my estimate of what that would be. I am not a forecaster, but what I do think is relevant is the level of the Bank of Canada's overnight rate compared to inflation expectations. That's why I said earlier, if inflation expectations stay down around 2%, then the Bank of Canada doesn't need to raise its overnight rate all that far in order to contain the problem. At the moment, though, it seems to me that inflation expectations are likely rising. Even the Bank of Canada's last forecast didn't have inflation getting back to 2% for a couple of years plus. And so the higher inflation expectations begin to go, the higher the overnight rate itself needs to go. And at this point, I'm getting concerned that we might need to see an overnight rate of 3, maybe 4%. That's not as high as it got during the last disinflationary episode, but it's quite a bit higher than what people are ready for, and it's certainly higher than what the government is expecting in its fiscal plans and the cost of servicing its own debt.
Mr. Robson, your institute issued an intelligence memo dated January the 25th, in which you're quoted as saying, inflation is high where monetary policy has been inflationary and low where it has not. You mentioned Switzerland as a jurisdiction where inflation has been kept low. Canada's is high and going higher. What is it that Switzerland has done that Canada has not done to control inflation?
A short answer, please.
My short answer would every country that controls its own central bank is in charge of its own inflation rate because it's a matter of supply and demand for money. The euro area all has a common currency, so to some extent they can say it's a bit of an international problem affecting the euro area, but every central bank controls the value of its own currency. We have our own central bank. We sometimes talked about adopting another currency such as the US dollar. We decided not to because we wanted control of our own currency. We have control over our own currency. It's up to us to determine our inflation rate.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Fast. That's the time. We are moving over to the Liberals, and welcome, MP Sorbara. I know you are a longtime member of this committee. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and great to see so many of my colleagues this morning. Just a couple of quick comments. First off, on the related topic today, on monetary policy. Obviously, that was my specialty during graduate studies. I did my thesis on monetary policy at the University of Toronto, so it's very relevant to the world we live in. and I also worked through and experienced the 08-09 financial crisis crash. I interviewed on Wall Street during the 1997 October crash, worked through the ABC asset-backed commercial paper freeze-up here in Canada of a $30 billion freeze-up, and also was a survivor and worked through the events of 9/11 when I worked down in New York, and then obviously coming through COVID, another experience here now on the more practitioner government side. To the C.D. Howe Institute, the inflation we're dealing with here as a monetarist, and I've read everything from Friedman to Hayek and Dodge to Larry Summers in the most recent, I think pertains to a lot of supply chain issues. You look at used vehicle prices and chips and new vehicle prices, what's happened there. Very important. I do agree we need very well anchored inflationary expectations. That is very, very important. Money is a store of value, a store of wealth for Canadians. But I would argue that global inflation has been largely caused by the supply chain and global issues. And we needed to have, and Mr. Robson, and I think you would agree, that we needed to have a bazooka-type response to the pandemic when nearly overnight a third of the Canadian economy and a large chunk of the world economy froze up. And we needed to have an appropriate fiscal and monetary response. I would define those two measures as appropriate, as an economist by training and as a practitioner in the global financial markets for over 20 years before I became a member of Parliament, and having worked and lived through the other financial crises that existed, those responses were pertinent. Would you not agree that the responses were pertinent? And then we'll get to today.
I said already with respect to the fiscal and monetary measures that I think that under the circumstances, they were broadly appropriate. And when it comes to whether they were exactly right, I would cut people quite a bit of slack because they were operating on such a scale and under such time pressure. Having said that, though, we now have a situation where nominal spending is growing far faster than the economy's ability to produce goods and services. I would express what you did about supply chain issues a little differently. It's true that some are spectacularly worse than others, particularly in energy markets right now. But across the board, what we're seeing is a constrained ability of the economy to produce goods and services. The labor market has come back very strongly, but business investment's been very weak and productivity growth has been weak. So the ability of the economy to generate goods and services in real terms is constrained. And if you continue to run a monetary policy and fiscal policy that presumes that the economy can grow a lot faster in a sustained way, then you'll end up with inflation because you've got too much money chasing too few goods and services.
And we all know about the aggregate supply versus aggregate demand side on the economic side and what's happening there. And I would argue that one of the very positive outcomes of the pandemic is that we have limited scarring on the economy, whether it's measured by our labor market, whether it's measured by GDP. The Canadian economy is obviously now larger than where it was pre-pandemic. And so forth. Obviously, there are indirect consequences on credit markets when you have to lower rates. And I'm not speaking for the Bank of Canada, nor would I do so. Obviously, we need to look at measures in terms of helping Canadians, ensuring Canadians can afford to purchase a home, especially first-time buyers. We do know that 70% of Canadians actually own their home and have paid off their mortgage. Home ownership rate in Canada is hovered around that 70% rate. 95% of our housing market is actually private housing market with no government interaction at all with participants. So we do have a healthy housing market, but we do have issues that we're addressing. I look forward to seeing some of the measures that we put in our platform, like banning blind bidding, the Housing Accelerator Fund, and many measures to that extent. I have read your memos in terms of your intelligence memos from January and February. It's very thoughtful. And I do agree we need to have well-anchored inflationary expectations, both for business side. Your comment on productivity, Mr. Robson, that's been a long-standing issue under successive governments that we need to address our productivity challenge or gap versus the United States. I put out some of my own thoughts on how we should do that. And, great to see the digital adaptation program our government put out, Women Entrepreneurship Fund. I think we have more things to do, and I look forward to doing those things over the coming years. If you have any more thoughts on the productivity question, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, MP
Well-
Sorbara. That is the time. We are moving to the block, and we have MP Trudel for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Chair, before, when you gave your introductory remarks, you talked about major housing starts. I'd like to hear more about this. We're talking about the shortage of housing, and it's difficult, it's expensive. So we're looking for solutions. This implies the government should be doing more, that we should have more government housing or more public investment, given the housing crisis of the times. So when you talked about major housing starts, is this what you meant in your opening message? If we say that inflation is here to stay, it's clear that the people who are earning the least are, or have the lowest incomes, are the ones who are the most highly affected. Housing is a major expense for Canadian households. We have to assume that we must house everybody. So something where we get everybody involved, where government investment is targeted to the people who are most in need of it. It seems to me that this is something that we must do at this time. And when I talk about a general mobilization and engagement of everybody, very often people think about access to private property. And it's true, everybody can be an owner. But if you have choices to make, somebody who has $1,000 check per month and over 50% of it has to go to pay for housing, what's left for any of the other needs that person has? We have a collective obligation to find solutions so that each and every Canadian can be housed, and especially those who are the most vulnerable. There's something special in Quebec, which is community support for housing and for homelessness. I think this is something that is easy to understand. Somebody who spent years on the street, if you can help find them housing, but without accompanying them and helping them to budget and pay rent, pay Videotron, etc. The statistics say that very often after a few months, those people end up back on the street, because these people have to become used to having a normal life. If we fund community support in Quebec, that's being done well, and that leads to savings in terms of social costs for housing, for health. Could you elaborate? Yes, community support gives people who are further ahead in terms of independence. Everybody needs decent housing and to be able to manage it independently. But in some cases, some people have more difficulty with this. So community support is to provide support so that the people who could end up homeless or with various health problems, or maybe they have them already, they can resolve these or be supported so that they can stay in their housing unit independently and to save, therefore, on the health costs. And that's the savings of several $1,000s. Thank you, MP Trudel.
The NDP, and we have MP Blakey. Welcome back for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back. I feel compelled, having just spoken in the House on a motion about imposing a surtax on banks and profitable oil companies and big box stores as a result of the pandemic, just to say I know there's been some conversation about getting the deficit under control around the table. And of course, the other side of that equation is the revenue side of the equation. And it's one that I think is too often neglected in those conversations, and particularly in light of the growing gap in wealth distribution between the top 1% in Canada and the bottom 40% that are sharing just 1% of the wealth produced in Canada. Among those 40%, of course, are some of Canada's most vulnerable people. And I understand Ms. Farah was just at the end of her exchange with my colleague, Mr. Garrison, was talking about how new initiatives need to be targeted to make sure that they make sense and provide real and tangible help to some of those populations. So I wonder if she'd just like to pick up where she left off to talk about some of the ways good public policy might be able to target those groups, and if she has specific recommendations for this committee to pass on to government.
Thank you for the question, and to reconvene that idea. Indeed, I mean, it seems to me that there's not going to be a silver bullet to all of this. A multi-pronged approach is necessary. I do want to reiterate something around investment in housing. I really think we have to take a big step back in this country and understand that the way investment in housing is working right now is not working working for people who are low income and even higher income earners, that in fact what's happening is only wealth is being extracted. And while I understand the concerns around foreign ownership, I want us to be very clear. There are many, many domestic actors here. We're talking about Canada's pension funds. We're talking about real estate investment trusts. We're talking about individual investors who are now able to own multiple properties, 10 properties. All of this is decreasing affordability, decreasing affordable housing stock, and making it much harder for low-income people to just eke out an existence. People who've played by the rules, right? They've gone to school, they've got jobs, they just can't make ends meet. And so I think there has to be a real pivot in approach. So many of the policies that exist right now benefit those investors. That needs to be taken a look at. I'd love to see a finance committee hearing focused on the financialization of housing, or a HUMA committee hearing that really drills down on what we can do to curb the investment in housing. That to me would be an important emphasis.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Blakey. That's the time. Members, we have two more members to ask questions. We'll go to Conservatives, then the Liberals. And I just want to say we will have to leave a few minutes just at the end because we have to adopt a couple of budgets for our committee. So up next is the Conservatives' MP Albus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier in today's testimony, we heard a member opposite say that, and I quote, healthy housing market, that we are experiencing a healthy housing market. And, we found out last week that the national housing data just released by the Canadian Real Estate Association shows home prices are now up 29% from last year, the fastest pace of increases on record. Once again, the housing price inflation is widespread. And in Toronto, 36%, Montreal up 20%, Vancouver up 21%, Calgary up 16%, and Ottawa 16%. And these are just some of the major municipalities that have seen this. I would just ask, first of all, let's go to Mr. or Professor Dehija, please. Does Canada have a healthy housing market, in your view?
Mr. Chair, what I would say to that is that the housing market, like a whole range of asset markets in Canada and around the world, have been distorted really beyond recognition by unconventional policy, by quantitative easing, by the zero interest rate policy. So I would say no. With rates of growth of property prices that high, it's pricing out, as someone said just now, middle class people who earn an income, have gone to university, have graduate degrees. Where I live now in downtown Ottawa, I bought that in the fall of 2019, shortly before the pandemic. I couldn't afford to buy where I'm living right now if I had to buy it today. So, something is wrong with the housing market. And I would again trace it to a generalized distortion in our financial system, thanks to loose monetary policy, Mr. Chair.
There are so many people that make good money in this country, young people that are living in their parents' basement. They're paying through the nose on rent right now. And so to me, it just seems to be out of touch that members of the government side would say that we have a healthy housing market. Mr. Robson, the City Howe Institute recently put out a report on the housing market and how it's displacing our productive economy. Meaning that if an entrepreneur says, I have $100,000 to invest, you put it into your business, the rate of return on it is not at the same rate as you would with housing. So would you say that Canada right now has a healthy housing market?
Well, we may have too much of a good thing, and I don't mean to contradict anything that many of the housing experts in this group have been saying, but we have seen spectacular spending on residential investment over the last number of years, especially since the pandemic. And what concerns me is that it has eclipsed all other types of business investment for the first time in our history. So when I talked about the supply constraints of the economy, that was one of the things that was motivating my concern. We just are not seeing the investment investments in plant and equipment. We are not seeing the investments in intellectual property products that we need for future productivity growth. And I'm doubly concerned about that because we are seeing those in other countries, and especially in the United States. There's something else going on in Canada. To try and square the circle, it seems to me that one of the reasons we want to focus on the supply side is because the supply side, many of the things that constrain supply on the ground affect more modest income, less valuable in market terms housing, more than the big stuff. If you can only build a certain number of units, it's natural that you're going to be looking for the ones where you can make the most money. So some of the supply concerns that people talk about, for example, zoning bylaws and so on, probably add to that distortion. We've got a lot of investment in housing, but not enough of the kind that many of my colleagues on this panel have been advocating.
Professor DeHasia, do you feel that inflation is a made in Canada problem? Why or why not? And specific, does this also relate to housing?
Mr. Chair, yes, it's very much a made in Canada problem. You just have to look at how rapid the growth of any kind of measure of money has been. So it's very much made in Canada. A large part of that, sort of a parallel problem, again, is housing price inflation. So that doesn't show up fully in CPI because these are asset prices that aren't part of the fully captured in the bundle of spending. But I would say the housing problem, the housing price problem, the asset price problem, and CPI, yes, are a product made in Canada by the Bank of Canada, for the most part.
And who will be hit hardest by inflation?
I've been saying this, crying from the rooftop for months. It's the working poor and the middle class who are hurt the most by inflation. The wealthy have ways to hedge against inflation, fancy financial instruments they can put their money into. So inflation actually hurts the poor and the middle class the hardest, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Albus. That's the time, and we're moving to the Liberals. Be our last questioner, MP MacDonald, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My question is Mr. Robson. I think it was last week you had a column in the Financial Post, and you talked about the investment of residential investment outpaced all other forms of business investment combined in Canada, and the size of the residential mortgages far outpaced the size of business loans. Can you expand on the impacts or such developments have on the Canadian economy?
Well, the concern that I have, housing is great, and we have a number of housing experts on this panel who've been emphasizing how important it is. So it feels funny to be complaining about how much residential investment there has been. But the concern expressed in that column has to do with the fact that we are now investing more in housing than we are in every other type of business investment, as I said earlier. And it's the other types of business investment that are underpinning our income growth over time. It is quite literally the tools that workers need to do their jobs. And business investment outside housing has been quite low for a long time, and the capital stock per worker has been falling. That's a very unusual thing historically. It certainly doesn't seem consistent with rising living standards over the long haul. So one of the things that we say, because you referenced the credit market, is that the CMHC's mortgage insurance could be more risk-based. The taxpayer is backstopping way too much at the moment, and it would make sense for the CMHC to look again at that system, for the government to look again at that system, because if I'm a potential lender and I have an entrepreneur in front of me and I have a potential mortgage borrower in front of me, there's a guarantee on one side and not on the other, and that does skew the credit market towards lending to mortgages rather than to businesses.
Thank you. And another question is, we've had several economists talk about even as house prices have increased, there's a lack of upward pressure on inflation and consumer price index. So can you just explain that a little bit and what they mean by that?
If there's an afterlife and I ever have a chance to ask God how you should measure housing costs in a consumer price index, I'll be intrigued at the answer because no human has figured it out. You can weight the value of new houses relatively heavily, or you can go to more of a rental equivalence measure. because it's not obvious. Like housing isn't something that you use up all at once like a cup of coffee. But on the other hand, if you only look at it over the life of the housing stock, then you're going to miss some of that upfront cost. So every country has its own way of trying to deal with this. What you can say, though, about the inflation numbers that we're seeing right now is that the fact that housing has gone up so much means that there will be continued upward pressure in measured inflation for a long time as a result of it. And that's one of the reasons why we worry about inflation expectations becoming unanchored, because some of these things kind of have a long tail. And the longer inflation stays above 2%, the likelier it is that people will say, okay, I just don't believe the 2% target anymore.
MP McDonald, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? I'm going to go back to my colleague's question that you never had an opportunity to answer, because I think it's important, and it's on productivity, and it's been an issue that I think every government the past few decades have been dealing with. So I want to get your opinion on the productivity issue relevant to the question of my colleague earlier, if you wouldn't mind finishing that.
Business investment and productivity growth are very strongly correlated. If you look over time, or if you look across countries, you see that in countries where productivity growth is rapid, business investment is high, and in countries where productivity growth is slow, business investment is low. There's both cause and effect at work there. Businesses will invest more if the opportunities appear greater, and then putting new tools in the hands of workers, the most up-to-date software, the most up-to-date machinery, that helps workers be more productive. So you can argue the cause and effect side of it, and people do, but at the moment I'm seeing very low investment rates in Canada as a sign of concern. I mentioned that the capital stock per worker is dropping. That's never happened before over a period of years the way that it has lately, and that makes me concerned about future productivity growth and future income growth, including the incomes we'll need to get our fiscal house back in order. At the moment, since we're talking about inflation, the concern is just that the supply side of the economy is not growing very rapidly, and so as we're stimulating demand, we're getting more inflation than we want and not as much real growth as we want.
Thank you. And that's the time, MP McDonald. Thank you very much. And just to our witnesses, on behalf of the Standing Committee on Finance, the members, the clerk, the analysts, the interpreters, the staff, we do want to thank you a great deal for your testimony, for your answers to the many questions, and helping us inform our study on inflation in the current Canadian economy. So thank you so much to our witnesses, and have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, I just need your time for a little bit longer. The witnesses are off. Yes, clerk? Okay, great. So members, on Friday, the clerk would have distributed 2 budgets that we need to adopt. And that was for the one for the inflation study and one for the Emergencies Measures Act study. And I'm just looking to members if we could adopt those. Yeah.
Just wanted to know, are those budgets balanced or not?
These are balanced, but I
suggested they should be.
The funds are available. They are balanced. They're very prudent,
Good.
and as we do great work here.
Move approval.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, MP Albus.
Just briefly, though, if you could just have the clerk confirm that these budgets are reasonable given the expenditures, given the work that we're going to be doing.
Okay, clerk.
Nothing
and you
glamorous or different.
So it's for phone lines, headsets, and the food that's in the back, and those are the amounts that are the same for every committee. So it's nothing different.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, thank you, MP Albus. And looks like we are good. Shall we adjourn? Yep. Okay, we're adjourned.